All right, hey everybody, welcome back. We are going to be getting into a new group of lessons here today. This one is going to be centered around something called composition. So we're going to talk about what composition is. Part one is going to be just kind of a tutorial. We're going to think more about what goes into composition. We're going to do a little bit of an example together. Part two is going to be a little bit more complicated, but that's going to come later on, where you are going to be composing your own song of some variety. So let's get into this here and see what's going on. So, what is composition? Composition, simply put, means to write your own music. It's a fancy way of saying that when you sit down to write music, you are a composer. You are composing. There are many, many different ways that it can be done. There are some that are a lot more complicated than others. Now, when you're sitting down to compose, it all depends on what you would like to compose and things like that, which is why there's many different ways that you can compose. But at its most basic level, composing is done by adding pitches and rhythms to create a unique song. So think about anything you may have heard on the radio or on Spotify or in a movie or wherever else you might have heard music. All of those pieces of music, those songs, the pieces of music, the instrumental stuff, all needed to be composed at some point or another. And that was done using just pitches and rhythms at its most basic level. That's all it really comes down to. But, like I said before, there's many different ways that this can happen. So in order to make things a little bit easier, we impose rules on composers to limit what they can do and how they can do it. It's very much like if you have a lot of choices. So I kind of like it as, you can think of like a candy store. So you got a whole mess of candy all over the place right in front of you, and you can buy whatever you want. Now, you might go to the familiar things that you know you enjoy, but sometimes with too many choices, it becomes a lot harder to make any choice. Think about it. If your parent or grandparent or guardian or whoever has ever taken you to the store and said, you can get anything you want, sometimes it's really hard to choose what you want to get. So that's why these rules that we impose as composers are really important, because it limits what we are able to do. It takes away some of those choices, so we no longer have every choice imaginable. We have a smaller group of choices, which makes things a little bit easier for us when we start to compose. So getting into this here, we're going to be talking about a specific type of composition, which is the rhythmic composition. So to do this, we're going to be utilizing the following rhythms: quarter notes, pairs of eighth notes, half notes, and quarter rests. And yes, I know that we know about other types of rhythms. I know we've spoken about whole notes, and I know we've spoken about various different types of rests. But we are going to be limited to these so we don't become overwhelmed by too many choices like I was just talking about. So using these different types of rhythms, we are going to take a look. Now, we do need to remember a couple different things. So remembering that the quarter note is 1 beat long. Half note is 2 beats long. The pair of eighth notes is a beat, but it has 2 parts of that note because it is 2 different eighth notes put together in a pair. This is going to be really important because in the following slides here, we are going to see the various things that go into composing a rhythm. And we do need to make sure we are very aware of how many beats these get. Now, I did mention the quarter rest as well. Now, it may not be on this page right here. However, it's very similar to the quarter note. If we think back to our earlier lessons, we can remember that the quarter note and the quarter rest are very similar to one another in that they both get 1 beat. One just happens to be sound and one just happens to be silence. So once again, we're using that quarter note. Let me turn this little laser pointer on here. Quarter note, that guy. Half notes, which is this guy right here, 2 beats long. And our pair of eighth notes, which is a single beat, but has 2 eighth notes that are part of it. Remember, don't get caught up thinking that the eighth notes are 2 beats long. They are only 1 beat, ladies and gentlemen. So we need to know these because we're going to talk about the composition process. So the process is going to be fairly simple, and it's going to be repeated several times until the composition is finished. We got to think back to earlier this year about those elements of the staff, and we're going to think specifically about time signatures, measures, and bar lines. Now, if you think back, time signatures are going to control the number of beats that are going to exist in each measure. What they're going to do is it's going to set a limit on the number of different beats that we can have. Now, it does limit the number of notes, but remember, the number of notes in a measure and the number of beats in a measure are not the same thing. Got to be really clear on that. The number of beats is different than the number of notes. All right? The measures are small units of music with a specific number of beats. You can think of this as the words in a book. They are going to be separated by bar lines, which is going to allow us to see those measures a little bit more easily and make things a little bit easier to read. Because honestly, if we're just looking at a bunch of notes all over the place, it is going to be a little bit more confusing. So we do need to make sure that we are separating those notes into measures. So continuing the process here, we're going to be using the time signature 4/4. Okay? To write this, we're going to draw two 4s on top of one another, just like you see there on your screen. So those two 4s right there are our time signature, and what that tells us is that there are 4 beats in each of the measures of our composition. All right? The top number is the one that we really pay attention to. If you think back to our previous lessons on time signatures, we talked about what the top and bottom numbers meant. We do need to just remember that the top number is the really important one for right now, telling us how many beats we have inside of our measures. You will notice that the staff we are using only has one line. Now, I don't want this to be a confusing thing, but this is a special type of staff. It's called the percussion staff. And this staff contains one line. It's used for rhythmic percussion instruments. We're talking drums, shakers, claves, etc. Claves are those wooden kind of circular or cylindrical objects that we click together. Very similar to rhythm sticks, but they have a little bit of a different kind of sound to it. So one of the dead giveaways of the percussion staff is that you do not have a treble clef. You have what's called the percussion clef right here. It's 2 lines at the end of your single lined staff right there. And what that shows us is that the rhythm instruments that we're going to be using are all going to be just in there because it's rhythms. It doesn't need pitch. We don't need to go up and down that vertical on the staff. We only need to go horizontal to create those rhythms. So each of the small tick marks that you see on the staff is a bar line. And that's what separates the music into measures. If we think back, we do have those bar lines to help make things a little bit easier to read. Now, even though we have our bar lines here, you can see I'm kind of pointed to in blue, we don't have music in our measures. Obviously, normally, if we were writing this from scratch, and I'm showing you this right here, we may not necessarily have all of this written out already. But the bar lines are going to come after we get each of our different beats into our measures. So that 4/4 time signature right there, each time we have 4 beats, we're going to add a bar line in. That's going to cause a new measure to happen, and we're going to start that whole process over again. We'll discuss that in just a moment here. So just remember, bar lines are what we're going to use to separate that music into measures. And at the end, you've got a special type of bar line. It's called a double bar line. You can see it pointed to in blue right there. Sometimes this is called a final bar line. Now, to be completely honest, I can't remember if we did speak about this or not, but either way, the double bar line is a special type of bar line, and it only occurs at the end of a composition. It's very much like the period at the end of a sentence. So what this does is the double bar line at the end of a composition shows us that we are finished, that there is no more music that we need to worry about. So, for example, if you look at a piece of sheet music right here, this is a piece of trumpet music that I have. And you'll see at the end here, I'll hold it up, you have a double bar line right there, and that's showing us that that music is completely finished. That means that we would stop the music right there. And if we were moving on to another movement or something like that, we would do that. So each of the different movements of this song that this piece that I have here has a, double bar line at the end, which shows us that we are finished. All right. So when we have our compositions, we do need to make sure that we have a double bar line as well, because we need to show that eventually we are finished. You know, it would be very much like having a big run-on sentence and we don't put any punctuation in it. We got to make sure we have punctuation to show that it is finished. Okay? So now that we remember what's on the staff and everything, it's time to begin adding rhythms to create our own unique composition. For each measure, we have to add up to a total of 4 beats. So we're going to begin by adding rhythms to our measure to equal 4. Now look right here. We started off with a half note. Now if we think back to earlier in the presentation here, the half note is 2 beats long. Now we know we need to add up to 4. So if we have 2 beats taken up for this half note right here, we then have 2 more beats remaining in our measure. So if we have those 2 beats left, we can add, for example, a quarter note. Now, this is not the only combination. There are a lot of different things. This is just what I happened to come up with at the time that I was putting this presentation together. So after we've done that, we have a quarter note, or excuse me, a half note, pardon me, and a quarter note. Now, if we remember, that's 2 beats plus 1 beat. So we have 3 beats total inside our measure. Now, we got to get up to 4. So looking here, we cannot add in anything that is greater than 1, because if we have 3 beats already and we have 1 beat remaining, we cannot fit a half note inside of that measure, because it would be very much like trying to pour 5 gallons of water into a 4-gallon bucket. Now, if you have a 4-gallon bucket and you try to pour 5 gallons in, you're going to make a big mess and it isn't going to work. So compositions kind of work the same way. There's no mess. We're not going to have to worry about any of that. But we cannot have more than 4 beats inside our measure. So we need to choose some kind of rhythm that would work. Now, we could leave that quarter rest right there. I chose to put a pair of eighth notes in there because remember, even though there are 2 eighth notes there, there are still only 4 beats in that measure because 2 plus 1 plus 1 right here for the both of those eighth notes is 4. So yes, it does add up to 4 notes in our measure, but remember that 4 notes is not the same thing as 4 beats. All right, folks? So that's our first measure. Now, I mentioned before that we have that very simple process, and all we do is repeat that same process. So we're going to add in another note, another type of note or rest. So what I did is I went and I finished out the whole thing here. So after you've completed the measure, you repeat the process, choosing different rhythms, of course. Now, you can choose to start it off kind of similar, like if you want to have the half note in the beginning a couple times followed by a quarter note. That's no big deal. What we want to avoid when we're doing a composition is having too many of the same sorts of things happening all at the same time. Because realistically, think about it. If you were to listen to the same rhythm over and over and over and over again, would that be very interesting? I kind of doubt it. It would seem more like it would be just really boring to have to listen to that same thing over and over and over again. So when I went through and did this, I tried to add different rhythms in here. Now, taking a look here, if we look at this, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things inside that measure, but they still only add up to 4 beats because the quarter note is 1, so we've got 2 quarter notes right there, that pair of eighth notes getting 1 beat along with our quarter rest. So those all add up to 4. Same thing happens here. We remember back 2 plus 1 plus 1. Now, this looks a little bit strange for those of us that haven't seen it before. This is just 4 eighth notes that are attached together. There's nothing different about that from a regular pair of eighth notes. It's very much like you have 2 pairs that are just attached together up there, so 4 total. That's still 1 beat for that first set, 2 beats for the second set, 3, and then 4 for your quarter notes there. And then finally rounding it off with a half note and a pair of quarter notes right there, 2 quarter notes. So just remember, this is only one possible combination. There's many, many more combinations that exist. You can even start to see, if you just shift things around in here a little bit, you can take the same measures that I wrote right here and change around the different notes that are inside of them, and all of a sudden, boom, you've got a very different composition. completely different sounds, even though it uses the same notes inside the same measures. Okay? So that's kind of the end of the whole process for composing. Now, I know that this might be a little bit to kind of take in right now. So we're really just learning today about the process that we use to compose. There are going to be some self-check questions here that I would like you to take a look at and kind of just make sure that you are understanding what goes on here, remembering what the time signature does, remembering what the bar lines do, what a measure is, and maybe the process that we use to compose here. So make sure that you remember what's going on here. We're going to head back over to Otis, and I would like you guys to work on those self-check questions for me. So please make sure that we're doing this the best we can, because the next part coming up later, not today, but later on, is where you're going to get to put this into practice and actually sit down and be able to write your own rhythm. There will be more to come on that. So like I said, head on over, do those self-check questions, make sure that this is all sinking in so that when we go to sit down and do this for real, we're all on the same page and we all know what we're doing. All right? So let's get over to Otis. Let's take a look and check how we are doing.